Yeah, so apologies for the disconnection, listeners. So Paul, I think you were at the point where we're talking about diversity in the gut, and we were also just giving the analogy of the C. diff scenario.
Yeah, and I think that nicely highlights the importance of having high microbial diversity and high resilience among your gut microbes. So C. diff is a spore-forming microorganism, which means it's quite resilient. It can remain dormant for quite some time before reviving itself and beginning to grow and do dangerous things. And so it can be present in the gut in a harmless form. But then after somebody's been exposed to antibiotics, especially broad spectrum antibiotics, and those are used in instances where a medic knows that there's an infection but doesn't know what type of infection it is. So it's easier to give kind of a weapon of mass destruction to try wipe out everything. But of course, that causes collateral damage to the gut microbiota as well. And as a consequence, the normal commensal good microbes that are in your gut that will keep the C. diff at bay are now damaged or wiped out. And that allows the C. diff to grow and produces toxins. And it's those toxins that that result in the distinctive symptoms. So the diarrhea, C. diff associated diarrhea or CDAD that can be life-threatening for some individuals. And so there's an appreciation now that it's as a consequence of trying to preserve that microbial diversity or using narrow spectrum antimicrobials or trying to bring back in a diverse microbiota, that's the ideal way of curing that illness and controlling that microorganism. But I think there's lots of other instances where low diversity in the gut has been associated with an undesirable outcome or different symptoms.
Yeah, and I think it's a good segue to talk about how do we. So you mentioned fermented foods. Now, fermented foods, from what you were saying earlier, have this broad array of different microbes. So potentially, could we use fermented foods? Admittedly, we should say we need to understand these things a lot more from a scientific perspective to fully appreciate the benefits that they are exerting on the body. But fermented foods have been with us for thousands of years. They're already parts of many cultures. They're starting to come back into vogue in the West for sure. So could this be a strategy to introduce diversity in the gut? People, I mean, if you look at the microbiome researchers, most of them will call out plant food diversity, which I 100% agree on. So not to take anything away from that. But what's your thoughts on using fermented foods as also a strategy to introduce some diversity in the gut?
I think it's a great strategy, and it's not always so. If you consume lots of different types of fermented foods, there's more chance of getting the ones that you require in your system. And sometimes it's not even the microbes themselves from the food that establish or colonize that are the ones that contribute to your gut health or that increase diversity, but it's as a consequence of them growing and producing something else, like the lactic acid, which can then be used by other desirable microbes in the gut, kind of next generation health promoting microbes that aren't found in foods like Eubacteria and Roseburia and Rumnococcus and Akkermansia. And some of those things, like the nutrients and the end products of fermentation, and it encourages them to grow as well. So yes, prebiotics and plant-based fibers are good for your gut microbiota, but I think fermented foods, even early in life, can be desirable because, again, especially for infants after they're born, there's an issue again in Western society where, because not every kid is born vaginally, sometimes they're born through C-section, and then subsequently they're not given breast milk, but they're given formula. They're formula fed, and so they're not exposed to very many different microbes. And just because we're more hygienic, there's more consciousness around our environment and the bad microbes in our environment, lots of young kids aren't exposed to so many different microbes any longer and early in life. And it's thought that phenomena like that contribute to allergy later in life because our immune system has difficulty differentiating between the good and bad guys because it has never been exposed to the good guys early in life. And so I think there's things that can be done among the young, but also as we get older and by virtue of eating different types of foods, and especially fermented foods, that there's lots of merits to be gained. Which, if you're going to hone in on one particular fermented food, then you're taking a risk that you might just not have the right microbes in that food for your particular scenario. And therefore, by consuming lots of different types, you're giving yourself the best chance of there being something in there that will be particularly beneficial for the thing that your body might be susceptible to at that particular time or later in life.
Absolutely well said. So the variety is absolutely critical. What's your thoughts on what the research is suggesting? I know it's really in its infancy, but is there any particular fermented foods that are more well studied than others, that are perhaps a bit more evidence based to suggest that there are particular health benefits?
So in that regard, I guess I would lean towards milk kefir, just because it's the one that our lab has focused on as our kind of model fermented food most extensively. Um, so there's quite a bit known about that. Cheese is the best studied fermented food, but then it's studied more so from a technological point of view and with respect to its flavor and other different attributes. But nonetheless, there are microbes in there that I think there's merit in consuming them. There's an increasing amount of research relating to other foods then, like kimchi, sauerkraut, water kefir, kombucha, and kombucha in particular is getting very popular now. Both the kind of homemade variety that's made from scobies, but a lot of large companies are beginning to produce it, and even some of the companies that are better known for making beer and fermented alcohol products are now looking at kombucha as a means of kind of tapping into the health promoting market as well. So there's a huge revolution. The science is playing catch up in some extent, to some extent, because the the suggestion or the public wisdom or the message that's getting out there would suggest that all fermented foods are good. And yes, I do believe that people should consume as very many different fermented foods as possible, but the specific health attributes associated with each different fermented food isn't always very well understood. And then, as I mentioned earlier, even within our own example of milk kefir, there is such big variety from different locations. We've done studies in the past where we've gotten um, milk kefir grains from 25 different locations around the world. We've returned to that sort of approach now, and have engaged in a Facebook approach to try to get even more kefirs from different communities and different locations, so that we can study them, see how they differ, which versions are the ones that are good, as I say, for cholesterol, which might be the ones that are good for anxiety, which are the ones that are good for IBS. But I think that even that, you will have some general attributes that will be shared among all kefirs, in that they'll remove or reduce the amount of lactose in the food, but the specific tweaks and the specific health benefits will vary from one to the other, just because there's different microbes in there. And when I go back to the probiotic field, that's something that I really try to instill when I'm talking to people from the general public, that they think that if they take a probiotic, that it's a panacea, that it's solving every issue under the sun. But you really have to view them on a strain by strain basis, that the probiotic, for which there's a lot of research relating to IBS, won't necessarily do anything for you in terms of your traveler's associated diarrhea or some other sort of phenomenon. So you need to do your studies, read up the literature, and find out which is the one that is beneficial for you as a probiotic. And I think ultimately, with regards to fermented foods, at the moment, I would say consume as many different fermented foods as possible. But I'd like to think that through the research that we and others are doing, that it will be possible quite soon to have a tailor-made fermented food in which you have specific strains that you know will be very good for you in terms of specific desirable effects.
That's very well summarized, Paul. One question I have to follow up from that is let's get back to milk kefir. So you mentioned the grains are quite variable, and so what a lot of the big food manufacturers are doing is they're using these almost these isolates or powdered cultures. How do they differ to the milk kefir grain?
Yeah, so that's something where a question that I feel a lot of sympathy for the consumer in relation to, because it's very difficult to discern between a good milk kefir and a one that's not so good. And like for example, there are some products out there that are marketed as being kefir, but if you look at the side of the container, it will say that the microbes in there are Streptococcus thermophilus and Lactobacillus bulgaricus. And you'll know as a food scientist that those are the microbes that are used to make yogurt. So in
Yes.
essence, you're drinking a dilute yogurt that maybe some flavors have been added to, but it's no different from consuming any other yogurt. So there's nothing particularly special about it. You have other situations where people go a little bit beyond that. So they will market maybe something like that yogurt, but will throw in some probiotic strains as well. They won't necessarily be kefir associated strains, but they're trying to get something that's a bit more kefir like, or at least when you look at the side of the label, there's lots more names of microbes at the side, so it looks more convincing. The next level beyond that is, I think, is at least a somewhat better scenario whereby you can purchase strains that did originally come from kefir, and so you can make a product that you start with milk, and so you add in some Lactobacillus kefalofaciens and some genuine kefir yeasts into it, and so it will have some of the different uh, attributes that you associated with kefir. Um, the strains themselves won't necessarily have been studied in great depth to know what their health attributes are, but that's probably true for most kefir grains anyway, so that's probably not a bad product to consume. And then you have other kefirs that are made, they can still be made on a large scale, but through kefir grains, and that's through what's known as the Russian method. And even some large multinationals use this approach, whereby they ferment milk with kefir grains. The microbes enter into the milk and grow there, and then they take some of that milk and they use it to inoculate a fresh batch of milk, which allows them to produce the milk on a much larger scale. And so, in that regard, it is very much like a genuine kefir product, but is scalable. It is challenging for large scale production because what you make on one day is harder to control and it will be maybe slightly different the next day. So, quality control is an issue, but that's also true for people making kefir grains at home. And then you have the actual kefir grains at home type scenario, the artisanal producer that's using the grain immediately themselves. So there's those different alternatives. I guess where we're kind of going is that we like the artisanal approach or the Russian approach where you're using the kefir grains. But as I mentioned, that's quite difficult to reproduce. In that we've actually done a study, it's not published yet, where we've taken one kefir grain and we've put it into fresh milk day after day after day over very many weeks and studied how the microbiota changes in that milk. And it does differ quite significantly because you have more microbes coming in from the milk and different microbes start to take off and others don't do so well. And so you're kind of changing the composition over time. And that's fine because most of the microbes are still good. But if you're making a product and you need to have a particular flavor and you need to be sure of the shelf life and whatnot, then those inconsistencies are problematic. So what we're moving towards is a scenario whereby we can look at the best kefir grains that are out there, study the strains in greater depth by actually doing genome sequencing and figuring out what it is that they do in terms of different cell line analysis and different types of studies and different agar plate assays and so on. And pick those which grow together and have health benefiting properties and also have a nice flavor, and then put them all back together. So you have a situation that's a little bit like the other scenario where you pick individual strains and put it into milk and ferment it. But
Mm.
now you're not just picking strains in a willy-nilly fashion, in a random fashion, just so that you have lots of names at the side of a bottle, but actually you're getting the best microbes, the best health attributes, but making a product that you can make sure if you make it today, it'll be the same next week and it'll be the same next year, and you don't have any spoilage or other issues. And that's, I guess, important if you want scalability, because I'd like to, if I have a fantastic kefir grain at home that has lots of good properties and I'd like as many people around the world to consume it, there's only so far I can go with that kefir grain. You can't make tons of it. And so in order to make sure that as many people can benefit from that as possible, then you need to take this alternative approach where you pick best strains and add them back into milk in a more controlled fashion.
That's amazing, Paul. I could not have articulated that any better than you did, because this is a huge bugbear for me in terms of the standard of identity of a kefir product. There is no standard of identity. So again, as you mentioned, the regulators are still catching up in terms of the standards. The food standards code here in Australia. I think in the UK, you guys are, or certainly in your neck of the woods in Ireland as well, your food legislation is a little bit more flexible when it comes to alcohol production. So I think your tolerance, I know, for instance, I know in England it's about 1%. I'm not too sure about Ireland. In Australia, it's 0.5%. So literally, it is very difficult for commercial manufacturers to make a true kefir, because if you've got yeast in the product, then there's a high likelihood of the product being too high in alcohol, especially when you think of the product moving through the supply chain. So it's going to be extremely difficult in Australia to get a 100% true kefir, even if you're using the Russian bulk substrate method. It is almost impossible. So I feel for the consumer. I really do. And it's extremely annoying to me, and it's misleading to the consumer what a lot of these companies are doing on riding on that kefir trend, especially when you see this wonderful paper written by yourselves and your colleagues on all the particular health benefits, and then the consumer thinking they're going to get that with some of these products, which are nothing more than diluted yogurt with sugar and bits of fruit.
Yeah. It's it's a big bugbear of mine, and in fact, it's something that me and some of the other people who are doing research in the field have gotten together recently to prepare a consensus document for at least trying to convince the scientific community, but to try to influence industry as well. And that was brought together under the auspices of ISAP, the International Society of Probiotics and Prebiotics, at the International Scientific Association of Probiotics and Prebiotics, excuse me. And so what we've done there is we're in the process of completing an article whereby we come up with some definitions as to what really is a fermented food and what isn't. And so, I think something that might be sold or marketed as a kombucha, which is really just a tea to which sugar has been added and then pasteurized, and there's no living microbes in there, but maybe some flavors added to make it seem like it's pasteurized, should not be defined as a fermented food. And so we've tried to lay out some different criteria as to what should be acceptable and what isn't, in a manner that we're hoping will influence different legislators around the world to take a firmer stance as to what is permitted and what isn't when you put kefir or kombucha or water kefir on the side of the label.
Absolutely, and I felt it from the start of the conversation. We're definitely kindred spirits, Paul. We're definitely trying to wave that flag as much as you can. I think you're in a much better position to influence the regulators in Europe than I am, but I'll do whatever I can to support your mission, because it's certainly my mission as well.
That's super, and I think initiatives through your podcast and bringing all of this information out to the public at large is fantastic, because we as scientists try our best, and so we have different innovations or different approaches towards education and public engagement, but our reach is only so far. But by your podcast and other interventions and other discussions with the community, then that's a fantastic way of getting the science out there. So it's no point it gathering dust or being present in a very difficult to access peer-reviewed journal somewhere. We need to be able to translate that information and to explain it in a manner that everybody can understand.
Absolutely, Paul. And I'm very cognizant that I'm taking so much of your time. Just very quickly, I just want to fly through a couple of these benefits from that paper on the particular benefits of milk kefir, because to me, that's my savior with my particular journey and struggles with anxiety and depression. And milk kefir was one of the products that really helped me a lot in terms of improving mood. So I can certainly speak anecdotally on the product actually helping me. But in your paper, you guys talk about cholesterol metabolism. Then there's something along the lines of blood pressure, I think?
Blood pressure, yeah.
And angiotensin converting enzyme, antimicrobial activity, tumor suppression, increased speed of wound healing, modulation of the immune system, including the elevation of allergies and asthma. Are you very quickly able to speak to the evidence, the fact-based evidence behind why you guys made that statement?
Yeah, so I guess what we were doing in that case, so we prepared a review whereby we collated all of the information from all of the different labs that do research in this area. So all of that work wasn't carried out by us. But what we did was we looked to see what was out there already. And so much like you have different qualities of kefir products, you have different qualities of scientific journals as well. And so there are some science studies out there that might suggest that a kefir or a kefir byproduct or a kefir strain is good at tumor suppression. But sometimes those studies are using cell lines. And so a cell line is just where you take a cancer cell and you grow it in the lab, not in a human body, and see what happens. And a kefir strain might control that cell line, but then if you added water, you'd probably kill that cell line as well. And so that's in that case, you're kind of overreaching, and it's not really very rigorous scientific evidence. Others, there are human studies, and so there is genuine evidence relating to a particular kefir strain or a particular kefir product. And I think the ACE inhibition, the hypertension side of things, there's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of evidence associated with cholesterol. Whether the particular kefir that you're buying in your local shop or that you're making at home has those particular attributes is very difficult for the customer to know without a very in-depth analysis of it. But at least if you're consuming some kefir, there's a better chance of you consuming a food that has those attributes than if you don't consume kefir at all. The wound healing, there's a little bit of evidence, but not so strong. I think there's probably a strong likelihood that for some people there will be benefits from an IBS perspective. I think the anxiety side of things is probably still anecdotal, but I'm based on our understanding of the metabolism and the microbes that are there. I'm not really hugely surprised, and based on our studies with John that I've mentioned earlier, I think we will have some stronger evidence to support that quite soon. So some things that there's good evidence, others that is not so good, but it's not that there might never be evidence out there that it's really crazy to suggest that there are other benefits as well, but it's just that there haven't been enough scientific studies, especially not enough human clinical interventions to the sort of rigor that would be necessary in order for me to put my hand on my heart and say that's undoubtedly you're having this specific attribute. And so that's why we and others are trying to push the boundaries so that we can actually get the science to underpin some of the suggested health benefits and to take them beyond the kind of the quick and not so scientific studies, but actually do them in greater depth so that we can really be sure about what we're saying.
That's wonderful. So my takeaway from that, Paul, is watch this space as you and your colleagues and your team do further research, and as you publish your papers, I'll be watching with bated breath on what your findings are. But I'm quietly optimistic about the positive impacts that you'll find with kefir. Now, very quickly, let's just give people a little teaser about your work that you've done in the past on the sports aspect of the microbiome, because I'm sure a lot of athletes would be particularly interested. There's a company here in Australia called Microbiome who do whole genome sequencing, and they're doing a whole lot of work with the rugby teams at the moment, because imagine if there is ways to enhance the microbiome and get a benefit from a sporting perspective, that's of huge interest to a lot of sporting clubs around the world. So what's your take on that?
Okay, so real whistle-stop tour of our studies in that regard. So we started off doing the first study of its type with the Irish rugby team. It was about 2 World Cups ago. So back when Paul O'Connell and Brian O'Driscoll and so on were involved, it wasn't too difficult to convince PhD students to get involved there because they got to meet their idols until such time as they received the fecal samples from their idols, and then it probably wasn't so pleasant. And so they studied those fecal samples in great depth, and we saw that they were really amazing. They had really high diversity in their gut microbiota, and we referred to diversity in the microbiota previously. So they had really good diversity, and that seemed to correlate with diet and exercise, and diet, particularly in protein in that regard, seem to correlate with high diversity in exercise. So we've done lots since. We've done some studies with pouch potatoes, so people by their own admission who don't exercise a lot, and put them through different exercise regimes and put them on whey protein for a period of time to see if their microbiota diversity changes. It does slightly after 8 weeks, not dramatically, which suggests that there's no quick fix, that it's over a longer period that you need to change your lifestyle in order to have these benefits. We've done some studies that are published relating to the Irish athletes that went to Rio. The logic being to see to what are there different microbial communities in different types of athletes, and that did seem to be borne out. It wasn't sport by sport, but it did break down in terms of the type of sport. So whether it's an endurance sport or one that requires a lot of resistance training and so on. So there was a division there. Done some studies with Cricket Ireland over the course of a year, where they went to lots of different locations in the build up to the World Cup. And so some of those locations were ones where they were going to be exposed to more pathogens. We found that some of them did have gut symptoms and gut disorders, especially after a trip to India, and it seemed that their microbiota changed quite significantly. And so we're working with them to suggest some different interventions to try to protect them during other trips in the future. And then we have other different ongoing studies with rowing community and other general people in the public. We have a study with different club athletes of different qualities, different VO2 maxes, to see how their microbiota changes and differs. So it's really an area of very big interest for us. I think the big take-home point is that exercise, but more fitness, extended exercise over a period of time can improve your microbiota, and that certain sports nutrients can also have a beneficial impact on your microbiota as well. And that will not only improve your resilience, but also your sporting performance, but also potentially provide you with protection if you're traveling around the world and exposed to different pathogens and different viruses.
So I have to ask this question because I'm a huge fitness enthusiast. Now, if I was going to pick a sport, what type of should it be? More high intensity? Should it be more of a lower intensity sport that's going to improve my microbiome?
We're still trying to tease that out. And so with the couch potato study, we did study them. We set them up in the university gym, and we monitored and we put them through a training plan, but we did allow them to either go down the resistance route or the endurance route. And so they did a little bit of both, and some did more than the other. But the number of participants wasn't large enough that fell into each individual category to be able to discern definitively which was the better. And so we're still teasing that out a little bit. But so that's ongoing. I have some ideas, but I think it's early days. I'm hoping it'll be more the endurance side as a runner.
Mm-hmm.
I do a little bit of strength core training, but more for injury prevention. And so I'm hoping that I'm getting more benefits from that. But if necessary, I'll change to a more strength-based training if I'm finding if our results ultimately show that that's where you get the best benefits for your microbiota.
I'm actually the other end of the spectrum. I'm more high intensity kettlebell, heavy weights, short and sharp, 30 minutes in the gym and I'm out. So I'm quietly hoping for the other side of the coin. and you mentioned sports nutrients. And I was listening to one of your interviews and you mentioned something about whey protein and CK, but I wasn't sure what CK was. What's CK?
Okay. That was one of the most interesting outcomes from the athlete, the original rugby study. So we wanted to determine how much exercise they were doing, and now they have GPS systems and so on and so forth in their jerseys, but that's not of use if we want to compare them with people in the general public, and that's what we did in that instance. So we compare them with some amateur athletes, but also people that don't exercise very much. And so normally when you're doing a study of fitness, you ask questions of people in the general public in terms of how many hours of gardening you do every week or how many flights of stairs do you climb every day. So we weren't going to ask Paul O'Connell and Brian O'Driscoll those sort of questions to assign to determine their fitness. So we needed to find something that spans both of them. And so in that case, what we did is we looked at creatine kinase. And creatine kinase, CK, is an enzyme that you find in muscle. And when you go through extreme exercise, you have these kind of micro tears in your muscle that give you the kind of muscle pain that you suffer from after you exercise a lot. People think it's lactic acid, but more often than not, it's these micro tears in your muscles. And so the enzymes is released into the blood and you can monitor it. And CK is normally used to monitor as a detection of, say, a heart attack, because your levels of CK go through the roof if you've had a heart attack recently. So we received the blood samples from our athletes and from our controls, and we sent them into our university hospital for analysis. And next time we got a phone call asking us where did these samples come from. These CK levels are through the roof. These people are really ill. We need to get them in and to help them get over their heart attacks very quickly. But ultimately, it turned out that those were the athletes who had gone through. They were in pre-season training for the World Cup and were going through the toughest of training. And so their CK levels were just through the roof. But we use CK as our monitor of levels of exercise. So obviously people in the general public were much lower. Now, a few of our controls were involved in GA teams who had very rigorous training sessions the previous day, and one individual had done a marathon recently, so they were a few outliers. But then in general, the rugby guys were much higher. And so we were able to correlate the microbiota diversity with CK and show that, and that's where we saw our relationship between extreme exercise and differences in the microbial diversity.
So was it the higher the CK in their blood, the more diverse their microbiome was?
That was kind of the pattern. No, I'd be careful about over-interpreting that, because I think going out and really flogging yourself to death and putting yourself through crazy extreme exercise isn't necessarily good for you on a regular basis. But I think it was probably just more a reflection of the combined fitness and exercise that the athletes were doing over an extended period of time, that and the reflection of that in the CK values that was impacting or reflecting the microbiota, rather than CK per se, or the benefits of one specific very extreme exercise workout.
Yeah, I hear. So it was one particular marker, but it seems to be over a period of time. So these athletes have been training over many, many years to potentially achieve those results. So it's not just like Joe Blogs listening to the podcast where he's going to go and flog himself in the gym and get a better, more diverse gut microbiome.
Yeah, not over the space of a week, but over months, I think you will get a benefit. And then obviously, as we talked about protein, but I think diet in general is a factor there. So there was one particular rugby player who, I suppose, ultimately he got the microbiota he deserved, because he, despite how conscious we think that our superstars are with regards to diet, he at that time, he wasn't a fan of eating well, and so didn't consume very much vegetables and fruit and so on and so forth. And his microbiota was very much there with the couch potatoes than with the other people. Now, I've learned since that he's changed his ways, but it really just shows that there's no shortcuts, I guess. You can do all of the exercise and get the benefits from that, but you still need to be conscious of getting a good diet as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's a beautiful way to wrap up. And I'm so appreciative. We've gone well over time. I do apologize, and I appreciate the time that you've taken out of your day. You must be incredibly busy. And so with the huge gratitude. And so at the end of the podcast, I always ask my guests, Paul, if there was one thing that an audience member could do to improve their gut health, what would it be?
Eat more fermented foods.
Great. Perfect way to end the podcast. Thank you so much, Paul Cotter, all the way from Ireland, isn't it?
Yes.
Ireland, Cork University, APC Microbiome.
It's been a real pleasure. Really enjoyed it. It's the time flew. As a science nerd, it's great to talk science. So it's no inconvenience at all. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Paul. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, super. Thank you.